Elden Ring's history is a chain of broken records, conflicting memories, and myth layered over older truth. To follow it from the Crucible to the Shattering, track the turning points, when life was still raw and mixed, when order was imposed, when power was gathered into one system, and when that system finally came apart. The story begins long before the Golden Order, in an age when the lands between were shaped by the Crucible, the tangled source from which life itself seemed to emerge. Each later era adds a new claim over the world, and each claim leaves behind enemies, exclusions, and fractures that matter later. Before the Erd Tree became the world's defining symbol, the lands between belonged to something older and less fixed. The Crucible is described as the Erd Tree's primordial form, but that description can make it sound more orderly than it was. In this earliest period, life has not yet been divided into the stable categories the Golden Order later insists on. It is mixed, abundant, and unfinished. Traits later treated as impure or abnormal are still part of a world that has not been sorted into doctrine. That matters because the Golden Order does not appear from nothing. It grows by rejecting parts of what came before. The Crucible Age is the baseline later rulers try to overwrite. Many of the features tied to it are eventually treated as relics of a less refined time, especially by institutions that want a cleaner version of life. So this era is not simply before civilization. It is a different kind of civilization, one where power, life, and identity are still wider than the rules that come later. The political landscape also seems less unified. The lands between are home to many peoples and factions, but the surviving record is incomplete because later powers had strong reasons to reshape it. What remains suggests a world where different forms of life and belief existed side by side, before the Erd Tree became the dominant symbol, and before one faith claimed the authority to define what was natural. The Crucible sits underneath all of that as the memory of a time when the world had not yet been reduced to a single order. Some of the clearest traces of this older age survive through the way later doctrine reacts to it. The Erd Tree is eventually treated as the natural center of life, but the language around the Crucible points to a more fluid origin. That is why Crucible imagery keeps its weight even when it is treated with suspicion. It refers back to a period before separation became law. Horns, tails, and other traits associated with that era are not just decorative details, they are signs that life once followed different rules. The Golden Order does not create order out of nothing. It inherits a living world and decides which parts are acceptable. This is also where early divine influence begins to appear. The lands between are not yet under Marika's rule, but they are not untouched by higher powers either. The Greater Will, the Elden Ring, and the Erd Tree belong to a later stage of history, yet they point toward the direction the world is already taking. The Crucible is not the final state of existence. It is the starting point from which a more organized system begins to form, one that will eventually support Marika's authority. That transition is gradual, and that is part of why Elden Ring's chronology is so difficult to trace. There is no clean break where the Crucible simply ends and the Golden Order begins. The world changes through pressure, conquest, and shifting belief. Older powers are not erased at once. They are pushed aside, reinterpreted, or recast as signs of backwardness. By the time Marika rises, the world has already been prepared for a new kind of rule. That slow change also explains why the Crucible survives in fragments rather than in a full historical record. What remains is filtered through later institutions, so it usually appears as relics, descriptions, and inherited practices instead of direct testimony. When the Golden Order looks back on this age, it does so from a position of judgment. It treats the old world as raw material that needed refinement, when the refinement is really just one historical choice among many. The Crucible is not only a biological idea, but a political one, a way to classify the past and justify the present. So the age of the Crucible is not just the distant past, it is the unstable ground beneath everything that follows. It gives the lands between their first shape, but it also leaves them open to being remade. Marika's rise begins after the lands between has already been shaped by the Crucible, an age of mixed life, older powers, and no settled divine order. What changes under Marika is not just the ruler at the top, but the structure of power itself. The world moves from plurality and instability toward hierarchy, law, and a single sacred center. Marika becomes the key figure in that shift because she is bound to the Greater Will and to the Elden Ring. That makes her authority more than political. It is religious, cosmic, and administrative at the same time. The Erd Tree rises as the visible symbol of this new order, and the Golden Order develops around it as the system that defines who is blessed, who belongs, and who stands outside the proper shape of the world. As that structure takes hold, the Old Age is not erased, but it is increasingly treated as primitive, impure, or incomplete. A major part of Marika's rise is conquest. The lands between are not unified peacefully. Her power expands through war, absorption, and the defeat of rival forces that resist a single ruling principle. This is where the Golden Order starts to look less like belief and more like control. Lands, peoples, and traditions are brought under one divine center. Some are destroyed, some are folded in, some survive only in reduced form, tolerated so long as they do not challenge the new order. That expansion matters because it shows the new age is not simply proclaimed from above. It has to be enforced, and it leaves resentment and loss behind, even when it succeeds. Marika's rule also depends on drawing lines between acceptance and exclusion. A unified order needs an enemy, or at minimum, something it can define itself against. The traits associated with the Crucible, once part of the world's mixed beginning, become increasingly suspect. Bodies, bloodlines, and forms of life that do not fit the new ideal are pushed to the margins. Divinity itself changes meaning here. Closeness to power no longer means only strength or antiquity. It means being recognized by the new system and made legible within it. Anything outside that system becomes easier to diminish, hide, or persecute. That is what makes Marika's reign so complete. She is not just one ruler among many. She becomes the figure around whom legitimacy is reorganized. If the Crucible represents a world where many possibilities still existed at once, Marika's age is one where power is sorted, named, and ranked. The Erd Tree stands for that order, but it also functions as a boundary marking who is inside the new age and who is left at its edges. Even grace and blessing start to work like political language, dividing the world between those aligned with the Erd Tree and those pushed away from its center. But the foundations of Marika's rule also contain later instability. The Golden Order depends on certainty, yet it is built over older contradictions rather than clearing them away. The history of the lands between does not vanish under the new system. It is buried, reinterpreted, and in some cases used as a weapon. That is why Marika's rise is both a triumph and a warning. She brings coherence to a fractured world, but it is a coherence imposed over something older and more complicated. The act of making one truth dominant creates pressure around everything left unresolved. By the end of this era, Marika stands at the center of a new age, and the Golden Order dominates the lands between. The shattering begins inside Marika's own order, not with an outside invasion. Once the Golden Order is established, its weakness becomes harder to hide. It depends on a single source of sacred authority, and when that center is damaged, everything built on it starts to fail. That is why this part of the timeline matters so much. The collapse is not random, but its consequences spread fast, because one break at the top touches every level of the world beneath it. The first clear sign is the death of Godwyn the Golden. He is not a minor casualty. He is Marika's son, one of the key figures in the ruling family, and part of the dynasty's future. His death matters because it strikes directly at the line connecting Marika, the Erd Tree, and the order built around them. Even more important, Godwyn does not die in a clean or final way. Something of him remains, but in a corrupted state, leaving behind a wound the Golden Order cannot properly contain. That makes the damage permanent. It is not just grief. It is a flaw in the foundations of the world. Once that kind of corruption exists, the old system can no longer pretend it fully governs life and death. That death is tied to the Night of the Black Knives, one of the central conspiracies in Elden Ring's history. The details are deliberately obscured, and what survives is fragmentary, but the result is clear. A stolen form of death is turned against Godwyn in a way the Golden Order was never ready to answer. That is why the event becomes more than an assassination. It becomes a failure of the system itself. If the Golden Order claims authority over life, death, and the shape of reality, then a death it cannot properly resolve is a direct challenge to everything it stands for. Godwyn's fate exposes a contradiction the Order could ignore before, but not after. Its rules are meant to be absolute, yet here is a death that breaks their logic and leaves behind something the world cannot neatly explain. Marika's role is one of the most important parts of the timeline, because she does not appear to be an innocent bystander. The lore strongly suggests she is tied to the destruction of the Order she created. Whether she intended the full result or only part of it is unclear, but the larger point does not change. Marika is linked to the act that breaks her own system. That turns the shattering into more than a political disaster or family tragedy. It becomes an internal fracture inside divinity itself, with ruler and order collapsing together. That matters because the Golden Order is not an ordinary kingdom. It rests on the authority of the God who established it. If that God turns against the structure or helps unravel it from within, the foundation loses the one thing that made it seem permanent. Once that crack opens, the demigods no longer have a stable center to gather around. Marika's children and heirs had been held together by her authority and by the legitimacy that came from the Erd Tree, but that authority no longer holds. In a world where rank, blessing, and power all depend on the same sacred order, the loss of the center creates immediate conflict. Each major figure is left with a claim, but none can restore the whole. The result is not a smooth transfer of power. It is a scramble over fragments of authority that no longer fit together. Different heirs, different regions, and different ambitions become isolated around whatever part of the old order they can still control. Instead of a single chain of command, there are competing centers of power, each trying to survive as if the world beneath them has not already changed. This is why the Shattering is more than a background event. It marks the point where the Golden Order stops functioning as a unified structure and becomes something broken beyond repair. Before the Shattering, Marika's rule could still stand as the foundation of the lands between. After it, that foundation is gone. The demigods inherit not an empire, but a ruined center, and the remains of a power that no longer binds them together. The problem is not just that the throne is empty, it is that the system that made the throne meaningful has already failed. No one can simply step into Marika's place and make it whole again. From there, the story turns into a struggle over what is left. The war that follows is not just a fight for territory or succession. It is the result of a world where the old order has already failed, and every surviving power is trying to prove it still has the right to rule what the Shattering left behind. Some cling to inherited legitimacy, some rely on force, and some retreat into their own domains rather than accept the reality of a broken age. But all of it follows from this same collapse. Once the Elden Ring is broken, the demigods do not gather behind a new ruler. They move in different directions, each one clinging to whatever claim they still have. That is what turns the Shattering from a divine crisis into a real war. It is no longer centered on one capital or one decisive battlefield. It spreads across the lands between as Marika's children and descendants begin dividing what is left of the world. The great runes sit at the center of that struggle. They are not just signs of status, they are fragments of the broken order, and whoever holds them can still argue that the old hierarchy has not fully disappeared, but no one gathers enough of them to restore the Elden Ring. So the demigods become rivals in the most practical sense. They are no longer part of one ruling family trying to maintain a shared system. They are competing claimants, and every region tied to their influence becomes part of the fight. That is why the war feels less like a single campaign and more like a chain of collapsing power centers. Each demigod's territory becomes its own problem, with its own methods of rule. Some rely on inherited authority, some on fear, some on religion, and some on conquest. There is no central command because the collapse of the ring has also destroyed the political structure that once connected these figures to one another. Status still matters, but only if it can be defended. Some of the demigods are better prepared for open war than others. Morgott holds Leyndell and tries to preserve the old capital as if the Golden Order can still survive from within. That matters because it shows the center is not gone in a literal sense. It is still there, but it no longer commands the obedience it once did. The capital remains a symbol of continuity. Yet that symbolism has limits. Morgott can guard the throne, but he cannot restore the loyalty that once gave the throne power. Outside the capital, other forces build their own domains. Liurnia, Caelid, the mountaintops, and the underground regions all become places where the aftermath of the Shattering takes a different shape. No single front decides the outcome because the war is too fragmented. Rykard shows how far the world has drifted from a shared order. Instead of trying to preserve the old system, he rejects it and builds a different kind of power around his own domain and beliefs. That makes him less a conventional claimant and more a sign of how deeply the political landscape has changed. Once the Golden Order stops holding, the demigods are not just fighting for a throne, they are choosing whether to defend the old world, replace it, or abandon it. The Shattering War has no single ideology. It is driven by broken inheritance, and each major figure responds to that break in a different way. Radahn shows another side of the conflict. He becomes tied to Caelid and to the idea of war itself, but that still does not produce restoration. The fighting consumes strength without creating a stable winner. In a healthier system, military success might lead toward succession. Here, it only deepens the ruin. Radahn's power helps define one corner of the conflict, but it cannot turn the broader struggle back into a functioning state. The same is true across the board. Winning one region does not solve the larger problem, because the larger problem is that the system of rule has already collapsed. Melania and Miquella remain central to the larger history of the setting, but their paths do not bring a clean resolution either. Miquella's work continues in the background rather than ending the conflict, and Malenia's campaign leaves devastation behind instead of unity. That pattern repeats across the war: enormous power, enormous loss, and no final settlement. Their presence also shows that the Shattering is not just a contest of armies. It is tied to long-term plans, unfinished ambitions, and larger designs that keep moving even as the world around them falls apart. No one wins outright because the Shattering has broken more than armies. It has broken the structure that made victory meaningful. In the age of the Golden Order, a victor could plausibly inherit the world because the world still had a center. After the Elden Ring is shattered, even the strongest demigod only controls part of the wreckage. The war becomes a process of exhaustion, not consolidation. Strongholds are held, then lost. Regions are scarred, then abandoned. Alliances fail because they were never built on anything sturdier than blood and temporary advantage. Even when a ruler holds land, that land no longer connects cleanly to a larger whole. That is why the Shattering leaves the lands between in stalemate. The demigods are strong enough to keep one another from ending the conflict, but none of them is strong enough to rebuild what was destroyed. The old order cannot be repaired by force, and the new order never arrives on its own. By the end of the fighting, the world is not ruled by a clear successor. The Tarnished return to the lands between only after the Shattering has already broken the old order. By then, there is no single center of power. The demigods are at war, the Elden Ring is fractured, and grace is one of the few forces still pushing history forward. The Tarnished are not ordinary wanderers or outside witnesses. They are exiles tied to Marika's order, warriors who were stripped of grace and driven from the lands between. Their return shows that some part of the system still works. Even after the collapse, grace can still reach across exile and call them back. That is the first sign that the Age of the Shattering is not only about destruction, but also about replacement. This is what makes the Tarnished so important in the timeline. The demigods can still fight over land and claim pieces of broken authority, but none of them can restore the world alone. Each one is trapped inside the damage the Shattering created. Grace calling the Tarnished back opens another path. Instead of waiting for one of the existing powers to recover the old order, the story turns toward outsiders who were never meant to inherit this crisis, but are now being brought in to resolve it. That shift matters because the Tarnished are not returning to a functioning kingdom. They come back to a land already split by war, famine, corruption, and failed ambition. The Golden Order still exists as an idea, but not as a stable reality. Its authority has broken into competing fragments, and those fragments are defined by their inability to win outright. Every major power in the lands between is fighting inside the vacuum left by the Shattering, not rebuilding something that was merely interrupted. In that setting, return is not a normal homecoming. It is a re-entry into a conflict that has already moved past the point of clean resolution. The Tarnished who return are not a single unified force. They are scattered, broken, and shaped by different motives. Some come back hoping to prove themselves. Some are driven by resentment. Some simply have nowhere else to go. What links them is not loyalty to any faction, but the fact that grace has found them again. That puts them in a rare position. They stand outside the rival claims of the demigods, but they are still connected to the same divine framework that gave those claims meaning in the first place. They are outsiders, but not separate from the system that exiled them. That matters because their return is not random. It is part of a larger pattern in which the old order refuses to disappear cleanly, even after its central laws have been shattered. The return also shows how much of the world's structure has survived in damaged form. Grace still exists, but it no longer governs everyone equally. It reaches selectively, choosing who is brought back and who is left behind. That makes the Tarnished different from the demigods, whose power comes from inheritance, lineage, and possession of great runes. The Tarnished have lost status, but they have not been fully cut off from the world's deeper design. In practical terms, that means they can become agents of change precisely because they were removed from power before the crisis began. They are not responsible for the Shattering itself, but they are now positioned to inherit its aftermath. That is also why the Tarnished matter so much once the player enters the story. By the time they return, the lands between are already deep into the consequences of the Shattering. The major powers are weakened, the regions are scarred by war, and no one can restore unity through force alone. There is no intact throne, no stable succession, and no clean way back to the age that came before. What remains is a deadlocked world, waiting for someone to move through the wreckage and decide what comes next. The conflict has become less about who started the collapse, and more about who can survive long enough to shape the result. The return of the Tarnished changes the timeline because it marks the shift from collapse to succession. The demigods could start the war, but they cannot finish it in a way that heals the world. The institutions of the old order are too damaged to recover on their own, so the burden falls to the exiles who were cast out, then called back. Their arrival is the point where the story stops being only about ruin and becomes about the possibility of a new age. It is not a solution yet, but it is the first real movement after the system has frozen into conflict. At this stage, the lands between are still unresolved. The old world has fallen apart, the surviving rulers are exhausted, and the future has not been decided. What comes after the shattering depends on the Tarnished's path. One ending restores the Golden Order in a repaired but still rigid form. Another leaves the world to the chill of the stars. Others burn the old structure away or replace Marika's rule with a different principle. However it ends, the sequence is the same. The Crucible gives way to the Erd Tree. The Erd Tree begins a god-governed age. That age fractures under ambition and betrayal, and the shattering turns collapse into open ruin. Elden Ring's timeline is the slow breakdown of a divine order, and then the question left behind: what, if anything, should replace it?